A. Darity Jr. is a professor of public policy, African American studies, and economics at Duke University. A. Kirsten Mullen is also an educator whose work focuses on race, art, history, and politics. In their book, From Here to Equality, William Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen confront racial injustices head-on and make the most comprehensive case to date for economic reparations for U.S. descendants of slavery. Their book has three main areas of focus. First, the intergenerational effects of white supremacy on Black economic well-being, assessing monetary value to historical wrongs. Second, the literal and figurative costs of justice denied in the 155 years since the Civil War. And third, a detailed roadmap for an effective reparations payment program. Taken individually, any one of the three areas of injustice outlined by Darity and Mullen, slavery, Jim Crow, and modern-day discrimination, makes for a powerful case for Black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. The Liberation Movement is proud to present a Lifetime Service Award to writer, folklorist, museum consultant, and lecturer A. Kirsten Mullen, and professor, author, and African American reparations advocate William A. Darity Jr.
All right, we have a treat for you. So you actually have an award here, and I'll read it to you.
We have no idea.
Yeah, it says the Liberation Movement for your scholarship of liberation through reparations, William Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen. So this is from the Dr. Freeman LLC, and also the Liberation Movement. Can we bring attorney Brittany Hughes back on, please? Yeah. Right. So she was one of the former aides. Well, could you introduce yourself and just share a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I was previously a deputy legislative director and counsel for Congressman John Lewis prior to his passing, and I now work in economic policy at Ernst & Young, primarily on issues that deal with the financial services industry.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We had no idea whatsoever.
It's okay. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and we just wanted to celebrate your work, and thank you for your contributions. One of the things that we're going to do, thank you for reminding me, we have 10 free copies of From Here to Equality, Reparations to Black Americans in the 21st Century that we're going to provide to the first 10 people that email us, and you'll see kind of the digital banner that's going below on the screen. If you email us at thelibmovement@gmail.com, email us your information. We'll get the book to you. But I just had in the last couple of days, we had the opportunity to really go back over the book, in particular your chapter 13, and really looking at the plan, and wanted to maybe ask you a few questions. Brittany, could you maybe throw out a question, and then I have over 40 questions, but we'll keep we'll keep going.
Sure. I mean, it's a little on the spot, but I guess given the research and everything that you guys have done, and understanding the economic impact of not just slavery but also Jim Crow on the Black community in the U.S., what do you feel would be the most efficient mechanism for repaying that? Like, what does that look like in 2021? As opposed to what it might have looked like in like 1940
or 1865.
Yeah.
This racial wealth gap, which is the difference between what Black households have in wealth and white households, and that's a figure of about $840,000 today. and you're looking at about 11 to 12 trillion dollars debt owed by the U.S. government for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. But it's because of the failure of the U.S. government to make Black American descendants of U.S. slavery whole, at any point from the Civil War's end forward. This amount has only grown over that period of time. There was a proposal at the end of the Civil War to, not just a proposal, but a promise to provide 40-acre land grants to the newly emancipated Black citizens. But that promise was denied them. And then coming forward, you had, the federal government making substantial wealth investment opportunities available for white Americans. The Homestead Act being perhaps the most signal one, providing 160-acre land grants beginning in 1862 to white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe. So we're talking now, as I said, about 11 to 12 trillion dollars. It's a debt that we would imagine would be paid over a maximum of a decade, and that it would be paid in the form of direct payments to the eligible recipients. And the eligible recipients would be, people who could, individuals who could meet two standards, two eligibility standards, a lineage standard and an identity standard. So I've mentioned, these are individuals who are descended from at least one person, one ancestor who had been enslaved in the United States, and who also have self-identified as Black, African American, Afro-American, or Negro for 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations plan or the enactment of a reparations study commission. So, the U.S. government would have been much better, been advised to have paid the debt, a century and a half ago when it was much, much smaller. And certainly African American descendants of U.S. slavery would be in a much better position financially, much more secure position today had that debt been paid, and had Black Americans been protected. And that's the other important piece. Either the Union Army would have needed to have been in place continuously, probably throughout the 19th century, to protect them, or the Black community itself would have needed to have been armed so that it could protect itself.
I would just add that the important point from our perspective is that people be given monetary payments so that they would have full discretion over the use of the funds. So at the end of the Civil War, the premise was that you gave people land allotments. Our feeling is that in the 21st century, it's more appropriate to give people a sum of funds similar to what's been done for other groups, victimized communities who have received reparations, whether it's the German government making payments to the victims of the Holocaust, or it's the US government making payments to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II. The people, if they want to purchase land, certainly can do so, but if they want to do something else with the funds, then it should be a matter of their choice and discretion.
Sorry, Sydney, if you don't mind, I have a follow-up question. Okay. I think that's really interesting that you said that, because prior to you all joining, Sydney and I were kind of having a back and forth about whether or not land or versus, money or other mechanisms was appropriate. The question that I have now is kind of like, given this wealth gap, given, the reality of how Black Americans, the quality of life that they have in the U.S. versus what, other races might experience. You mentioned that there would be payout over a 10-year maximum time frame, right? And so my question is then, if we continue, if we were to get those payments, starting tomorrow, and new Black children are being born every day, and let's say that many of the obstacles that or the problems that we set out to cure have not been remedied. Is there a threshold that we would want to hold, or say like 10 years time maximum payment, given that Black people are able to obtain at least this certain level of quality of life. Like, is what I'm saying making sense? Like, let's say that wealth gap continues to exist, even though these reparations are being paid. Then what would we do? Or what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that you could see as a possibility?
Do you mean that the wealth gap would come back into existence because you eliminate it by definition virtually?
The payments would eliminate the racial wealth gap.
Mm-hmm.
But are you suggesting that something else would happen that would cause it to grow again, or?
Yeah, or that it would continue, or that it could grow again. And really what I say is that if given monetary payments, but a lack of access, perhaps to certain investment opportunities or certain means of making my money grow, could then, make that money not as valuable as it maybe otherwise could have been if I came from a different racial background. Then what do we do? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure what you mean by lack of access.
So if I get $100 today and I say I want to invest in this business because I know it'll provide me $300 tomorrow, but for racial reasons I'm denied that opportunity, have the $100 that I've received as a part of reparations been beneficial to has it really been beneficial?
You're talking about some sort of discriminatory
right, exactly,
that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you certainly can't compel a private individual to sell a share of their property. But if you're talking about a bank or some financial managed fund, there are no racial barriers to that. I mean, it's just a question of whether one is aware that they exist. But there shouldn't.
There are laws that should be mobilized for the purposes of trying to eliminate discriminatory actions. You're correct that the payment of reparations in and of itself does not eliminate racism.
Right.
Okay, it does not necessarily eliminate all discriminatory practices. It certainly gives people a greater capacity to cope with those conditions, but there's a quotation we use from Malcolm X in our book that you may recall, where he talks about an instance in which somebody has plunged a knife into his back 9 inches, and he makes the distinction between the knife being pulled out and healing the wound.
Right.
And so from our perspective, reparations is an attempt to heal the wound, but the knife also needs to be pulled out, which means the kinds of discriminatory practices that have taken place that have led to the racial wealth gap are practices that have to be stopped. But that's not the same as making the reparations payments in and of themselves. So we'd say 2 things. One, there is a need to eliminate those discriminatory practices. And the third component of what we describe as reparations, closure, won't be satisfied unless there's no renewal of the atrocities or there are no new atrocities that take place, even after the payments are made. But secondly, let's not underestimate the impact of these payments, that they really do alter the capacity of individuals who are Black to really cope with the conditions in this society.
And also to access legal counsel, to participate in the political life. You can certainly, do more than volunteer if you have the financial capacity to support candidates whose views and values are simpatico with your own. I wanted to say something too about the question I believe you're asking about, young people, babies being born across that, say, 10-year decade, the 10-year period when reparations payments would be made. We would absolutely need to set a target date, whereby the total number of eligible recipients is set. And from that day forward, there would be no additional people added to the list. So it's not that any children any of us may have 2, 3, 5 years from now would also be eligible for reparations payments. That's not the case.
But the parents certainly can transfer the resources across
if they so choose. But there wouldn't be this indefinite period where, funds would be available
Right.
into perpetuity for Black Americans of U.S. slavery.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I appreciate you both explaining that, because I think oftentimes when the conversation around reparations is framed, it is looked at as a solution to discriminatory behavior when it is not necessarily. And I really appreciate you.
No, it's compensation for the effects of
Right.
discriminatory behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I had a question here. So in chapter 13, you describe what you call a portfolio of reparations. I'll give you what I was able to assess out of that. The first thing was establishment of a trust fund, maybe monthly checks or a lump sum grants for asset building that would help with home ownership, additional education, voucher for growing financial assets. So within that context, can you kind of give us a perspective on what a portfolio of reparations might look like?
So we're thinking about, getting back to this, as Sandy mentioned earlier, direct payments to individuals. So this might, as you mentioned, it might be in the form of a trust fund. It might also be an annuity, an endowment. But these are funds that would have the recipient's name attached to them, not some consortium, not a community collective, but the eligible recipient's name would be attached to those financial instruments. It could be a lump sum. If it were an endowment or annuity, it may be the case that the individual could only use the interest, but that the principal would remain in place. Since we're talking about building wealth, but others have, said, well, would it be useful to have some funds set aside for historically Black colleges and universities? Certainly that would be something that would be in addition to these direct payments to the eligible recipients from our point of view. We don't see those kinds of payments. You mentioned, grants for asset building, which could be, I'm sure all the things that you're imagining would fall under that umbrella. But, for us, for our purposes, those decisions should be made by the individual recipients, not made for them. So we're not, in support of, some auxiliary, trust account, auxiliary organization that will invest these funds on behalf of the eligible recipients, but rather putting those funds directly under their control so that they can decide how they will be spent.
I mean, if there were to be programmatic initiatives or community level initiatives, those would have to be above and beyond the direct payments to the eligible recipients. And we're a little squeamish about some of that, given the fact that we have rapid gentrification in the United States. And so communities don't remain stable. And so there's no assurance that the resources would go to the folks who merit the resources if you relied upon community level or neighborhood level projects. But we don't exclude those altogether. We just want to be sure that that's above and beyond what is committed to the individual recipients.
So Franklin and Barry talked about this notion of a super fund, right? Could you talk about what is that and why might it be important in a discussion about reparations?
So, a lot of people, feel more punitive and think that it's really important that corporations and communities of faith and other organizations that benefited from, from slavery, that benefited from Jim Crow and discrimination taking place now should be made to pay a financial penalty for those advantages that they received, and that those funds would be put together, perhaps together with funds from the federal government, and managed in such a way that they would be given to the eligible recipients. But there's no way that you could compel them to put those funds aside. It would have to be a voluntary project. I'm not sure, how you would put pressure on them to do that. You know, part of the difficulty is that the activities that they engaged in, whether they, owned Black bodies, if they leased them, if they, in some ways rented them, those activities were legal at the time. Immoral, yes, but they were legal. And there have been any number of groups that have tried to mount a legal case, but they've run into, at least two types of barriers. One, the statute of limitations has run out, and the other that, according to the court,
Yeah,
and the other that, they were doing nothing illegal at the time, and so they should not be punished. But I think that was the idea behind the Superfund. There's certainly nothing wrong with these organizations deciding to use their their profit to support a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I would love to see, a group of corporations decide that they would hire, a top-rate lobbying firm and blanket the country with, an educational program, helping the nation to understand why, why the racial wealth gap must be eliminated, how it came to be in the first place. A big part of the reason we believe that many people, Black and white, but especially white Americans, oppose reparations is they really are not aware of our nation's history. They, are not, it's rare to meet anyone who has knowledge of the Red Summer. We know more about the White Massacre in Tulsa now because of Trump's trip, and then more recently President Biden's trip to Tulsa, Oklahoma. But that was one of over 100 such massacres that occurred. I mean, in an 18-month period, bracketing 1918 to 1919, over 35 such massacres took place. And I think people are stunned to hear that. And you can research these massacres down to, in many cases, learning who the white people were who were involved. And people can see, oh my gosh, that's my great-great-grandfather. It makes it real to people in a way that, hasn't been the case before, because first of all, we haven't talked about it very much. And we certainly have not had many people attempt to quantify the extent of the damage to Black people, not only injuries and deaths, which were substantial, but also the property that was lost, and people having to leave in the dead of night, often with only what they could carry, and having to abandon their homes, abandon their businesses, and any inventory that their businesses contained. So education is really, really important in this context.
Yeah, they were compelled to abandon the community that they had known and had grown up with. The perhaps the most dramatic example is one that Kirsten mentioned, which was Tulsa in 1921. But I think it's an example that we are just recently familiar with because of the attention that was drawn to it since we'd arrived at the centennial of the massacre. But there were almost countless other instances where this took place, where Black lives were lost. And then from what's significant from the standpoint of the racial wealth gap is the fact that Black property was appropriated and seized by the white terrorists, and in many instances is still held by them or their descendants to the present day.
In Wilmington, North Carolina is another such location. 1898 was the year of that massacre. And this is a city that was, Black majority, and Black men were duly, legally elected, officers from the city up. And, there was a thriving Black business district. The Black newspaper was the largest, had the largest subscription base in the South. And it was, the population of Black people dwindled after this. I mean, you're talking about, I think the voter rates dropped from something like over 60% participation to less than 10 for Black men. And then you begin to see, looking at
and the city goes from being a majority
to a majority white city. But then you also see in the days and weeks after the massacre, huge numbers, just page after page after page in the magistrates log books of new owners of the properties that had been formerly owned by Black people. Did the Black people agree to have their property taken over? This is research that has yet to be done. I don't think that was the case. Yeah, I think it was simply appropriated because they were absent, and there was no one to contest it.
Well, I want to go back to something that so Attorney Hughes and I we disagreed at the beginning of our discussion about, and that is kind of just the foundation on the way that we should go about getting reparations, right? So I'm sure you've heard the discussion where maybe we should have more of a Pan-African approach where we go through the United Nations and we think about it from a diasporic perspective, where we try to gain reparations globally through, where United Nations is kind of the big one that I'm thinking about, but Brittany may have some others. Could you talk about, and Brittany, feel free to jump in. I don't want to mischaracterize your position, but could you talk about why you approached the development of your reparations program the way that you did?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
For us first or to Brittany? Sorry. Oh, okay. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. We started with the presumption that the community that is owed a debt is the community that descended from the individuals who were promised and denied the 40-acre land grants in the aftermath of the Civil War. And this is specific to the U.S. experience. And so this is a debt that is owed uniquely to that community by the United States government. So that was the starting point. There is, of course, a potential diasporic claim that could be made, but that would be distinct and separate from the claim that we're making in the pages of From Here to Equality. And what has happened customarily with respect to other communities in the Black or African diaspora is that they've made their own claims on specific national governments based upon the experiences of their communities. So, for instance, the Congo is in the process of making a claim on Belgium. The CARICOM countries collectively had made claims on the European nations that enslaved their ancestors and colonized them. So Jamaica is making a claim that is specifically directed at the United Kingdom. And we've consistently said that Haiti has a long-standing claim on France. And, the paradox in that situation is that France actually compelled Haiti to pay reparations. And so we think Haiti should get that money back with interest. But Haiti has been subjected to a huge amount of brutality since it was the country that had the first successful war of slave liberation. So our thinking is that everybody throughout the diaspora virtually has some claim for reparations, but the claim is not targeted or directed at the United States government. And so each diasporic community should make its claim on the appropriate, responsible, and culpable party.
CARICOM, neither CARICOM nor members of the Congolese community have included Black American descendants of U.S. slavery in their claims, nor should they. But the reverse is also true. Black American descendants of U.S. slavery should not be compelled to include other groups in their claim. When you look at the successful reparations efforts around the world, one of the things that we have learned is that being really specific about who you're targeting has made a huge difference in the ability of those claims to go forward. In the case of the Japanese American Redress Initiative, they were at the beginning of their efforts. Once the community became convinced that money reparations, as they called it, was the way to go. So initially they were focused only on an apology, but subsequently the community decided that in fact, monetary reparations would be something that would be sort of symbolically important, but also substantively important in the lives of the 117,000 people who were affected. But initially, they also targeted Japanese Latinos. So the United States government also incarcerated Latinos in Peru and in Colombia, and put them in prisons. Japanese Latinos put them in prisons in the United States. But as the architects of that redress movement, talked to more members of Congress, it became clear that they were not going to succeed if they had these non-American citizens in that redress movement. Now, eventually, they were able to have a separate effort that that was specific to the Japanese Latinos. Now, they received a smaller reparations payment, but they also did receive the apology. So, what we have seen is when you tend to lump these groups together, it tends to diffuse and dilute all of the efforts. We've not seen a situation where bringing them together made them stronger. Certainly the groups, I think there's a lot to learn from each other, sharing strategies, sharing research objectives. I think, rallying, that I think is a positive. But as Sandy was saying, the histories of these groups are not the same. We're talking about involuntary migration in the Black American, these people who were brought here in chains versus people who came here voluntarily for job opportunities. And I would say Black and white immigrants who came to the United States came here because of what they saw in terms of businesses and schools and highways and parks. All of these are things that were made possible by the blood, sweat, and tears of the Black Americans who were enslaved here. So two different kinds of issues here. They're complementary, but they're not the same.
Yeah, and I'd like to mention, we actually talk about this in our book. The United Nations has already made a call for reparations. The United Nations has a working group of experts on people of African descent. And I think circa 2016, they issued a report that called for reparations for Black Americans, emphasizing current injustices as well as enslavement and its long-term effects. And in particular, they were paying close attention to police executions of unarmed Blacks as another indicator of the range of atrocities that have taken place in the United States. And those atrocities have been directed in a cumulative way across the generations against Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. And so the UN has called for reparations already. What's the problem is the UN doesn't have the capacity to enforce any of its declarations on what country A or country B should do. And so that's something that has to be a product of the political struggle that we wage internally in the United States.
And I'm paying close attention to our time, but I did want to ask. So our platform has a lot of individuals that are people of faith, and so what can communities of faith do to, particularly Black community of faith, right? What can we do to push this type of movement forward?
I think it's important to, to petition and lobby Congress, to write letters, to develop resolutions supporting a national program of reparations for, Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, to be really specific about what you're talking about. There are folks who say, oh, we've got legislation in place in the form of HR, now HB 40, but this is legislation that we don't think is going to get us there. And neither of us support HB 40 at all, as written. We do not. And there are four basic reasons for that. HB 40 does not give a directive to the study commission that we think is going to do the job. It does not specify who the eligible recipients are. It does not talk about this lineage or this self-identity standard of individuals who are descended from Black American descended from an individual who was enslaved in the United States, or individuals who self-identify as Black, African American, Afro-American, or Negro, at least 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations program or commission. HB 40 does not identify the elimination of the wealth gap as its goal. It does not specify that the payment should be made directly to the eligible recipients. And it does not say that the bill should be paid by the federal government. It does not, say that the federal government is capable and culpable and should pay the debt. That's really important. But on top of that, the bill was changed dramatically in the markup session that occurred this spring. Originally, HR 40 provided for 7 commissioners. That number ballooned to 13, and now it's 15 commissioners, a very unwieldy number. The Japanese American Redress Commission began with 7 members. Interestingly, a quorum is established by 7 members. So 7 of 15, not a majority, not a supermajority, but 7. That's odd. Then the director, who would not be selected by either the president, the Speaker of the House, or the pro tempore of the Senate, the director has the authority to select 6 members of the commission. So the director's 6 members plus any one other person would constitute a quorum.
And the director is an administrative
position.
Like,
why is
not an actual member of the commission?
So why is the director given that authority? That's just an odd thing that was added. They now provide for a salary of up to an executive level 4, which would provide $172,000 a year. Now, we think that commissions, this is a sacred mission in our minds, and commission members of this type are almost never paid. The California Department of Justice Reparations Task Force is operating right now, and they're volunteers. What's up with this, with this payment? The length of time that the commission would have to do its work has been made longer. There's a provision that says that only, it says that no elected officials may serve. So no mayors, no governors, no cabinet members, no members of the Senate or the House may serve on this commission, which is really strange as well. In the case of the Japanese American Redress Commission, 2 members from the House and 2 from the Senate served, including individuals who were on the record as opposing reparations. And part of the reason that they did that was to increase the credibility of the commission. Elected officials are responsible and responsive to their publics, but this commission is responsible to no one. The other thing that is really concerning is that they have requested to be exempt from something called the Federal Advisory Commission Act. And that is a legislation that was put in place in the 1970s to make sure that commissions of this type do their work in the public, that they are required to have public involvement, that their meetings, the meeting times were made public, their minutes, the transcriptions, their reports are made public. This commission has requested to be exempt from that.
Yeah, I think HB 40 is a clever ploy because it gives people the impression that this is a way to support reparations or to declare your support for reparations. But it's actually an off-ramp away from true reparations. The other off-ramp is this array of so-called reparations projects that are being initiated at the local level. Whether it's Evanston, Illinois, or Asheville, North Carolina, or the state of New York has a reparations commission. California has its task force for reparations. I think what's important to recognize is that if you set as your objective elimination of the racial wealth gap, states and localities simply do not have the capacity to do that. So whatever they're doing, which might be extremely desirable, is not the equivalent of what a reparations project should be doing. And so they should call these things something else. But thus far, people are applying the label reparations to these local initiatives. And to give you a sense of how distant the capacity is of states and localities to exercise a true reparations project, we've said, I think Kirsten said early in this conversation, that it would require at least $11 to $12 trillion to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And the total combined budgets of all states and localities, and this would include New York, California, Evanston, Illinois, all cities and all state governments in the United States, their total combined budgets are about $3.1 trillion. So they simply do not have anywhere near the capacity to meet the bill. And the federal government is the culpable party as well. So not only is it capable, but it's culpable.
But we would hope that your listeners will get a copy of HB 40 and read it for themselves. We had not read it 5 years ago, and we were stunned. We thought we knew what it said.
Yeah.
But when we actually read it, we were shocked. Thought, oh, this is what the provision is. And it has become even less effective in the markup that took place earlier this year.
The version that appears, I think, online for 2020-2021 is actually previous to the version that came out of the markup session that the Judiciary Committee held in April. And both of them are unsatisfactory, but we would argue that the version that came out of the markup is perhaps even worse than the version that existed beforehand. I think people are not aware that the bill has been continuously rewritten over time and largely rewritten for the worse.
So we're getting close to our last few questions. I want to give Brittany, if she had maybe one more question. No pressure on you, but if you had one.
I don't have any other questions. Honestly, this has just been such a fortunate opportunity to hear you all speak on this in great detail. I really appreciate the distinction that you all made as far as like the need, while there is a claim to, or there might be evidence of need for a claim for reparations for the larger diaspora, separating the two from what the U.S. federal government owes individuals who are descendants of slaves here versus what the world might owe the Black diaspora generally.
Yeah. It's also the case too that there are members from the larger diaspora who have intermarried with Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, and their descendants would be eligible.
Right.
Yeah.
So
in
Brittany,
fact, it would be it's interesting to think about folks who never intermarried, right? Yeah, or folks who were free blacks who at no point ever intermarried with folks who were either enslaved or descendants of those who were enslaved. I would raise the question as to whether or not those are families that appropriately should receive reparations from the U.S. government.
Wow.
Well, Brittany and I attended the same HBCU, Oakwood College, when I was there. I believe she graduated when it was Oakwood University. And of course, we had the best choir in the world. I just had to throw that out there. The Aeolians. We're world champions. I did want to. I could not leave this broadcast without asking you the role of HBCUs in this work, both from the standpoint of pushing for reparations and what they may receive out of the process of gaining reparations.
Well, the HBCUs actually blacks with considerably lower resources make more contributions proportionately to the institutions that we value, whether it's our churches or whether it's our colleges and universities. But the problem is we simply don't have many resources to give. Yeah. And so if a reparations payment that would amount to, say, $350,000 per person was made, that would alter the capacity to make contributions to the institutions that we value, like HBCUs. And so we're actually talking about a very different landscape. So that's one way. The other route is to have a reparations fund that would include resources that would be specifically directed at HBCUs. But here's also an opportunity for the private sector to act, because the real limitation for HBCUs in comparison with many of the predominantly white institutions is HBCUs have very, very small endowments. And the private sector could make a strong change in that without it necessarily being part of a national reparations program.
So remind me, once upon a time, we did a back of the envelope calculation on the number of corporations and the amount of the gifts and the number of corporations that we thought might make them that could dramatically alter the endowment landscape for HBCUs. You remember what we were?
Well, I just remember that if we just look at J.P. Morgan Chase, which is the wealthiest American bank, they've got assets in excess of $3 trillion. So you could take 1% of that and distribute it across 5 to 10 HBCUs endowments, and it would have a positive effect. So yeah, I mean, that's another way to think about how HBCUs could be enhanced. I think the other thing, though, that we have to be concerned about is HBCUs don't always stay HBCUs. Well, they're always historically right. HBCUs, but they don't necessarily serve a majority of black students. Yeah. And the most dramatic instances are in the state of West Virginia with Bluefield State and West Virginia State University. Yeah.
And the current alumni are talking about changing the name of the school.
Yeah.
For example. Yeah.
And then you have these discussions about predominantly black institutions who are also in the mix of those conversations. I would ask, what's next for you? What's next for you in your work? How are you guys kind of pushing forward beyond the book?
Well, we have a new book that will be coming out.
Oh,
yeah, not just us.
Yes.
we helped to craft what's called the Reparations Planning Committee, which consists primarily of a group of scholars who've been trying to think about how we could refine the content of Chapter 13 and provide an improved vision of what a reparations plan should look like. And so I'm not sure exactly when it will come out. This is always a mystery, but the University of California Press has agreed to publish this edited volume. Yeah. So that's one project.
Yeah.
I mean, we
Brittany,
continue.
were you going to say something?
Well, so
that's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, we continue to write, opinion pieces and, giving lectures. We've had the very fortunate opportunity to have From Here to Equality taught twice in a local high school. Carborough High School, which is 2 cities over. And I think they're going to do it this fall as well. And have learned a tremendous amount about, how history is taught now in public schools, but also, what young people do and don't know, not only about our nation's history, but about their own families' histories. One of the things that their teacher, Matthew Cohn, has done is ask them to interrogate their own family's wealth positions. And is it an AP class? Or is it just
one of them is an AP
So I think it's 2
class
classes that come together. So there's a significant number of white students in the class, but it's been incredibly revealing, what they have learned. It's not it's not a bootstraps history that they have recovered in their families. It's a Homestead Act, land grant or GI Bill.
The GI Bill,
Yeah.
lots of
GI Bill.
I think almost all the white students had a grandparent or a great grandparent who had benefited from the GI Bill,
and from the home ownership and the farm ownership components of the GI Bill. Yeah.
And
none of the black students or the students of color had a GI Bill for those purposes. Education, yes, but not for wealth acquisition in the form of a home or a business or a farm or a business.
Well, I knew that you guys were the ones that needed to be on our program. Just your selfless work, even with the schools, taking it beyond just the academy, the academy, and reaching out to the community. We thank you. I will definitely get this award mailed out to you. We appreciate your service to our community, pushing this work forward. I want to also say thank you to Brittany Hughes for rolling with us and making this program what it's been. We've truly enjoyed this time. As we talked about what we're learning in our schools, our next program will look at critical race theory. And we'll have Dr. Emery Talbert, professor of history at Howard University. We also will have Ms. Porsche Vanderhorst that will be speaking about that with them. It's going to be an intergenerational conversation. She is a public school teacher that incorporates some of the tenets of critical race theory in her work there in the DMV area. So we're looking forward to that conversation. And after that, we're going to have Dr. Summer Wood. Dr. Summer Wood is a well-renowned educator and a private school teacher and principal, and she's going to be talking about Black parenting and Black education. So we're excited about those upcoming events. Again, thank you to Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen for so graciously being a part of our program. And again, Attorney Brittany Hughes for her contribution. Have a wonderful afternoon.
I am the liberation movement.
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 I am the liberation movement. My name is Dr. Sidney Freeman Jr., and I am the executive director and founder of the Liberation Movement, which is a 501c3 organization that works with those who are liberated and seek to be liberated psychologically, socially, and spiritually through educational initiatives. To continue to provide the high quality programming such as Saturday Soul, we need your support. Your consistent monthly investment in the movement will allow us to continue to expand on the excellent work that is already started, such as decolonizing the Black mind curriculum that is already in development. So your gifts of any size via Cash App, Venmo, or PayPal would be a blessing to the advancement of this ministry. Thank you in advance for supporting and joining the Liberation Movement.